That ring. Where did you get that ring? The words escaped Amara's lips before she could stop them, her coffee pot trembling in her hand as she stared at the ornate gold band on the customer's finger. The man sitting at table 12 in Rosewood Diner looked up from his newspaper with irritation, clearly unaccustomed to being questioned by waitstaff, but Amara couldn't tear her eyes away from the distinctive design that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. The ring bore an intricate pattern of intertwined roses and Arabic script that she had memorized from childhood, when her grandmother would tell stories about the precious family heirloom that had been stolen from their home in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. What neither of them knew was that this moment of recognition would unravel a web of theft, fraud, and exploitation that stretched across continents and would forever change both their lives. Samir Al Mansouri had worn the ring every day for the past decade, considering it one of his most prized possessions and a symbol of his sophisticated taste in rare antiquities. The wealthy import business owner had purchased it from what he believed was a reputable dealer in stolen goods, though he had never bothered to investigate its origins or consider that it might have been taken from someone who treasured it far more than he ever could. To him, it was simply another beautiful object that demonstrated his wealth and refinement. But to Amara, it represented the last connection to a grandmother who had raised her with stories of their family's proud history and the precious heirloom that connected them to generations of strong women who had survived slavery, segregation, and every form of adversity that America could inflict. The ring had been crafted by Amara's great-great-grandfather, Isaiah Johnson, a freed slave, who had learned the jeweler's trade from a sympathetic craftsman in New Orleans during the turbulent years of Reconstruction. Despite the legal restrictions that limited opportunities for black artisans, Isaiah had built a reputation for creating pieces of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication, often working in secret to avoid the resentment of white competitors who could not match his skill. The ring he had made for his daughter Sarah Bell's wedding was his masterpiece, incorporating traditional African design elements with European techniques he had mastered through years of careful observation and practice. "Excuse me?" Al Mansouri said, his tone sharp with displeasure at the interruption. "I don't recall asking for your opinion about my jewelry. Perhaps you should focus on doing your job instead of staring at customers." The dismissive response might have silenced most waitresses, but Amara had been searching for this ring her entire adult life, following leads that had taken her from New Orleans to Atlanta to Chicago and finally to this diner in Detroit, where she worked double shifts to support her 2 young children while putting herself through nursing school. She had never stopped believing that someday she would find the ring that had been her grandmother's dying wish to recover, the family treasure that represented not just monetary value, but the unbroken chain of women who had fought and sacrificed to give their descendants a better life. Her search had been methodical and relentless, involving visits to pawn shops, antique dealers, and auction houses across the South and Midwest. She had created a network of contacts among collectors and dealers, always showing photographs of the ring and sharing its story with anyone who would listen. Many had dismissed her quest as hopeless, but Amara had inherited her grandmother's stubborn determination and refused to accept that their family's heritage was lost forever. "Sir, that ring belonged to my grandmother," Amara said, her voice gaining strength as she processed the magnitude of what she was seeing. "It was stolen from our house after Hurricane Katrina, and I've been looking for it for 15 years. That's a one-of-a-kind piece that was made by my great-great-grandfather, who was a freed slave and master jeweler in New Orleans." Al Mansouri laughed, a sound filled with contempt and disbelief. "Young lady, this ring is worth more money than you'll see in your lifetime. It's a genuine 19th century Middle Eastern artifact that I purchased from a legitimate dealer. I seriously doubt that your family has any connection to such a valuable piece." The assumption that her family couldn't possibly have owned something valuable was exactly the kind of racism that Amara had faced her entire life. The automatic dismissal of black people's claims to ownership or dignity that had allowed thieves and exploiters to profit from their losses for generations. But Al Mansouri had no idea that he was speaking to someone whose grandmother had been a respected historian and genealogist who had meticulously documented their family's history and the provenance of every precious item that connected them to their ancestors. The documentation that Amara's grandmother had maintained, included not just family stories, but actual historical records, photographs, and insurance papers that proved the ring's existence and ownership. Grandmother Esther had been a retired librarian who understood the importance of preserving documentation, and she had kept detailed records of every piece of family jewelry, china, and artwork, knowing that such items were often the only tangible connections that survived between generations separated by slavery and displacement. "The ring has an inscription inside the band," Amara said, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest. "It says, Sarah Bell Johnson, beloved daughter and mother, 1872. My great-great-grandmother's name, the year she received it as a wedding gift. If you'll let me see the inside of that ring, I can prove it belongs to my family." The specificity of Amara's claim caught Al Mansouri off guard, because he had never bothered to examine the ring closely enough to notice any inscription. He had purchased it based on the dealer's assurance that it was a Middle Eastern antique, and the Arabic script on the outside had seemed to confirm that story. The possibility that it might actually be an American piece with African-American provenance had never occurred to him, and the idea that a waitress in a Detroit diner might have legitimate claim to his prized possession was almost too absurd to consider. His ignorance about the ring's true origins reflected a broader pattern of assumptions about African-American history and culture that had shaped his collecting practices for years. Like many wealthy collectors, Al Mansouri had been drawn to objects that seemed exotic and foreign, never considering that some of the most sophisticated and valuable pieces might have been created by American artisans whose work had been systematically undervalued and overlooked because of racial prejudice. Even if there were an inscription, which I doubt, that wouldn't prove anything, Al Mansouri said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. Family names are common, and anyone could have researched historical records to create a false story. This ring was clearly made in the Middle East, and I have documentation proving its legitimate purchase. But Amara could see the doubt creeping into his expression, and she pressed her advantage with the determination of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. "The Arabic script on the outside isn't actually Arabic at all," she said. "It's decorative writing that was designed to look exotic to people who couldn't read the language. My great-great-grandfather was commissioned to make jewelry that would appeal to wealthy collectors who wanted pieces that looked Middle Eastern but were actually made in New Orleans. He was one of the most skilled jewelers in the South, but because he was black, he had to disguise his work to get the prices his craftsmanship deserved." The revelation hit Al Mansouri like a physical blow, because it exposed not only his ignorance about the ring's true origins, but also his own prejudices about what kind of artistry and sophistication could come from African-American craftsmen. He had spent years showing off the ring as evidence of his cultural knowledge and refined taste, never realizing that it was actually the work of a former slave whose skill and creativity had been hidden behind a facade designed to appeal to racist assumptions about authenticity and value. The irony was devastating. Al Mansouri had prided himself on his appreciation for Middle Eastern culture and his ability to recognize authentic artifacts from the region, but he had been completely fooled by the work of an African-American artisan who had deliberately created the appearance of foreign origin to overcome the racial barriers that limited opportunities for black craftsmen in 19th century America. Other customers in the diner had begun to take notice of the confrontation, drawn by the intensity of the conversation and the obvious distress on both sides. Among them was Marcus Williams, a retired police detective who had spent decades investigating art, theft, and fraud, and who immediately recognized the signs of a major discovery unfolding before his eyes. He moved closer to the table, his trained instincts telling him that this was more than just a simple dispute over jewelry. Marcus had worked on several cases involving stolen Hurricane Katrina property, and he knew that the disaster had created unprecedented opportunities for thieves and unscrupulous dealers to profit from the displacement and desperation of victims. Entire neighborhoods had been evacuated for months, leaving homes and businesses vulnerable to systematic looting that had never been properly investigated or prosecuted. "Ma'am, are you saying this gentleman is wearing stolen property?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex criminal matters. "I'm saying he's wearing my grandmother's ring," Amara replied, her eyes never leaving Al Mansouri's face. "The ring that was taken from our house along with everything else we owned when we had to evacuate for Hurricane Katrina. We lost our home, our belongings, and our family history. But this ring was the one thing my grandmother made me promise to find, because it connected us to our ancestors, who survived slavery and built a life from nothing. The emotional weight of Amara's words was undeniable. But Al Mansouri was not ready to accept that his prized possession might be stolen goods. "This is ridiculous," he said, standing up from the table with the kind of indignation that came from having his integrity questioned. "I purchased this ring legally from a reputable dealer. I have receipts, certificates of authenticity, and insurance documentation. This woman is obviously trying to run some kind of scam." But Marcus had heard enough to know that this was no scam, and his experience with art theft had taught him that many valuable items stolen during natural disasters ended up in the hands of wealthy collectors who asked few questions about provenance. "Sir, would you be willing to let us examine the ring more closely?" he asked. "If there's really an inscription, as the lady claims, that would be easy enough to verify." Al Mansouri hesitated, because he was beginning to realize that his confident assumptions about the ring's origins might have been based on incomplete or deliberately misleading information. The dealer who had sold him the piece had been evasive about certain details, and Al Mansouri had been so eager to acquire what appeared to be a valuable antique that he had not pressed for thorough documentation of its history. The dealer, Viktor Petrov, operated out of a high-end gallery in Manhattan and had cultivated a reputation for providing wealthy clients with rare and unusual pieces that could not be found through conventional auction houses or established dealers. Petrov's clients valued discretion and exclusivity more than exhaustive provenance research, and many were content to accept his assurances about authenticity without demanding detailed documentation of how items had been acquired. "I don't have to prove anything to anyone," Al Mansouri said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This ring is my property, and I'm not obligated to submit it for examination by strangers in a diner." Amara could see that he was wavering, and she decided to share information that only someone with intimate knowledge of the ring could possibly know. "There's a small dent on the side of the band, just below the rose pattern," she said. "My grandmother made that dent when she was 12 years old, trying to polish the ring with a tool that was too heavy for her hands. She used to tell me that story every time she showed me the ring, how her mother had been angry about the damage but had forgiven her because she was trying to make it beautiful." The specific detail about the dent was something that Al Mansouri had indeed noticed but had never mentioned to anyone, assuming it was a minor flaw that reduced the ring's value. The fact that Amara knew about this hidden imperfection with such precise detail was evidence that could not be dismissed as coincidence or research, and it forced him to confront the possibility that everything he believed about the ring was wrong. Marcus could see the shift in Al Mansouri's demeanor and recognized the moment when denial began to give way to uncomfortable truth. "Sir, if this ring was indeed stolen during Hurricane Katrina, then possessing it would constitute receiving stolen property, regardless of whether you knew its origins when you purchased it. The ethical thing to do would be to verify the lady's claims and, if they're accurate, return the ring to its rightful owner." The suggestion that he might be guilty of receiving stolen property sent a chill through Al Mansouri, because he had built his import business reputation on claims of ethical dealing and cultural sensitivity. The revelation that one of his most prized possessions was actually stolen from a Hurricane Katrina victim would be devastating to his public image and potentially damaging to his business relationships with clients who valued authenticity and legitimate provenance. "This is preposterous," Al Mansouri said. But he slowly removed the ring from his finger with the reluctance of someone who was beginning to accept an unwelcome reality. "But if it will end this absurd accusation, I'll allow you to examine the ring. When you find no inscription, I expect a full apology for this harassment." Amara's hands shook as she accepted the ring that had been absent from her life for 15 years, the weight of it familiar despite the passage of time. She turned it over to examine the inside of the band, her heart pounding as she searched for the inscription that would prove her grandmother's stories were true and that this precious link to her family's history had finally been found. The inscription was there, exactly as her grandmother had described it, worn but still legible after more than a century and a half. "Sarah Bell Johnson, beloved daughter and mother, 1872. The words were exactly as Amara remembered them from the countless times her grandmother had shown her the ring and told her the story of the strong woman who had received it, as a symbol of love and cost. Commitment during the dangerous years of Reconstruction. Here it is, Amara said, her voice breaking with emotion as she held the ring up to the light so that others could see the inscription. Sarah Bell Johnson, 1872. My great-great-grandmother's name and the year she got married, just like I said. The verification of the inscription created a moment of stunned silence in the diner, as everyone present realized they were witnessing the resolution of a 15-year mystery and the reunion of a family with their stolen heritage. But for Al Mansouri, it was the beginning of a personal crisis that would force him to examine not just this one transaction, but the entire foundation of his business and personal collection. Marcus examined the inscription carefully, his detective training allowing him to assess its authenticity and age. This inscription is definitely original to the piece, he confirmed. The wear patterns and patina are consistent with the age of the metal, and the engraving style matches 19th century American techniques. This isn't something that could have been added recently. The confirmation of the ring's American origins and family connection created a new problem for Al Mansouri, because it raised questions about every other piece in his collection and every dealer he had worked with over the years. If he had been deceived about something this significant, how many other items in his possession might have dubious or criminal origins? I need to contact my dealer, Al Mansouri said, his voice hollow with the realization that his carefully constructed world of legitimate antiquities collecting was crumbling around him. If this ring was indeed stolen, then I was defrauded when I purchased it. I had no knowledge of its true origins. But Amara was not interested in Al Mansouri's business problems or legal complications. She was focused entirely on the ring that represented her connection to generations of ancestors who had survived slavery, poverty, and discrimination to build a legacy of strength and resilience. This ring means everything to my family, she said. It's not just jewelry, it's our history. When Hurricane Katrina took everything we owned, this was the one thing my grandmother made me promise to find, because it connected us to our great-great-grandmother, who survived slavery and built a new life with her own hands. The emotional significance of the ring was something that Al Mansouri had never considered during the years he had worn it as a symbol of his sophisticated taste and cultural knowledge. He had seen it only as a valuable object that enhanced his status and demonstrated his wealth, never thinking about the human stories and family connections that gave it true meaning beyond mere monetary value. Marcus could see that this situation required more than just personal resolution between Amara and Al Mansouri. Ma'am, if this ring was stolen during Hurricane Katrina, there might be criminal and insurance implications that need to be addressed through official channels. Have you filed police reports or insurance claims related to this theft? We filed reports with FEMA and the police, but we never got anywhere, Amara replied. We lost everything in the storm, and the insurance company said our policy didn't cover flooding. We didn't have the money to hire lawyers or private investigators, so we just had to accept the loss and try to rebuild our lives from nothing. The story was painfully familiar to Marcus, who had seen countless families victimized not just by natural disasters, but by the predatory practices that followed in their wake. Unscrupulous dealers had made fortunes buying stolen goods from looters who targeted evacuated homes, selling valuable items to wealthy collectors who asked few questions about provenance, as long as the prices were reasonable and the documentation appeared legitimate. Al Mansouri was beginning to understand that he was not just the victim of fraud, but also an unwitting participant in a system that had caused real harm to real people. The ring he had worn with pride was actually a symbol of his own moral blindness and the casual racism that had allowed him to assume that African American families could not possibly own valuable heirlooms or possess sophisticated cultural artifacts. I want to do the right thing, Al Mansouri said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of unwelcome self-awareness. If this ring belongs to your family, then you should have it back. But I need to understand how this happened, how I was deceived, and what other items in my collection might have similar problems. The admission was more than Amara had dared to hope for, but she could see that Al Mansouri's acceptance of the truth was driven not just by evidence, but by a genuine recognition of the harm that had been done. "This ring has been in my family for 5 generations," she said. "It survived slavery, Jim Crow, poverty, and discrimination. It was passed down from mother to daughter as a symbol of our strength and our refusal to be broken by anything that was done to us." The historical significance of the ring as a symbol of African American resilience and survival was something that Al Mansouri had never considered, and it forced him to confront his own ignorance about American history and the experiences of families like Amara's. He had spent years collecting what he thought were exotic foreign artifacts, never realizing that some of the most powerful and meaningful objects were created right here in America by people whose stories had been deliberately erased or ignored. "I'm going to return this ring to you," Al Mansouri said, the decision surprising him with its clarity and rightness. "And I'm going to help you trace how it ended up in the stolen goods market, because other families might be looking for their lost heirlooms too." The offer of assistance was unexpected, but Amara could see that Al Mansouri's guilt and shame were genuine, and that his desire to make amends went beyond just returning the ring. "There were other pieces stolen from our house," she said. "Family photos, documents, jewelry that belonged to my grandmother and great-grandmother. If you really want to help, maybe your contacts in the antiquities business could help us track down some of those other items." The prospect of using his business connections and resources to help reunite other families with their stolen heritage gave Al Mansouri a sense of purpose that was entirely new to his experience. He had spent years accumulating objects for his own pleasure and status, but the possibility of using his knowledge and connections to heal some of the damage caused by theft and exploitation offered a path toward redemption that he had never considered. Marcus watched the transformation taking place between Amara and Al Mansouri with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice emerge from unlikely circumstances. "I can put you in touch with law enforcement agencies that specialize in art, theft, and cultural property crimes," he offered. "If there's a network of dealers trafficking in stolen Hurricane Katrina goods, we need to shut it down and recover as many items as possible." The investigation that followed would ultimately expose a massive operation that had trafficked thousands of stolen items from Hurricane Katrina victims to wealthy collectors across the country and around the world. Al Mansouri's cooperation with law enforcement would lead to the recovery of millions of dollars worth of stolen property and the prosecution of dozens of dealers who had profited from the desperation and displacement of disaster victims. The network that Victor Petrov had established included contacts in New Orleans who had systematically looted, evacuated homes, shipping valuable items to dealers in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami, who specialized in selling to wealthy collectors who valued discretion over documentation. The operation had been so sophisticated that many victims never even knew their property had been stolen rather than destroyed, because the looters had been careful to target items that were not obviously missing from flood-damaged homes. But for Amara, the most important outcome was already complete. The ring that had connected 5 generations of strong women was back where it belonged, ready to be passed down to her own daughters, along with the stories of courage and determination that had kept their family's legacy alive through slavery, segregation, and every other attempt to erase their history and dignity. As she slipped the ring onto her finger for the first time in 15 years, Amara felt the presence of her grandmother and all the women who had worn it before her, the unbroken chain of love and resilience that had survived everything that America could inflict on a black family. The ring was more than jewelry. It was proof that their stories mattered, that their lives had value, and that no amount of theft or displacement could destroy the connections that bound them together across generations. Al Mansouri watched the reunion between Amara and her family's heritage with a mixture of sadness and hope, understanding for the first time that true value came not from the cost of an object, but from the human connections and cultural meaning that it represented. The transformation from collector to advocate would reshape his entire approach to business and life as he dedicated himself to healing some of the damage caused by his own ignorance and the system that had allowed him to profit from other people's losses. The ring that had symbolized his sophisticated taste and cultural knowledge became the catalyst for a deeper understanding of history, justice, and the responsibility that came with wealth and privilege. In recognizing Amara's rightful claim to her family's treasure, Al Mansouri had discovered something far more valuable than any antique. The possibility of redemption through service to others, and the healing power of acknowledging and correcting historical wrongs.